Good Monday morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press. I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to LibertyRadioLive.com. My pleasure to be here this morning. Welcome to stations in Moncton, New Brunswick, Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, Toronto, Ontario, stations in Massachusetts, Tennessee, Mississippi, Florida, San Diego, California, Jamestown, North Dakota. Welcome to all my listeners this morning. We're going to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Vatican Billions by Avro, Manhattan. We're currently discussing the Vatican's involvement behind banks, corporations, stocks, bonds, and other securities, diabolical business, and the adoption of a policy, a fiscal policy by the Vatican, that she would use no more stringent moral constraints to her business negotiations and operations than would any other commercial enterprise. And we're going to find out that she would use even criminal enterprises to amass more wealth, more gold, more stocks, more bonds, more land, more possessions than any other organized institution on the planet. Remember, the Vatican has had more than 1,500 years to amass her wealth, and she's expert at the business of amassing wealth. Now, last time we talked a bit about her involvement with Westminster Hambros Trust, and the Hambros Bank and Westminster Banks. We're continuing where we left off last time. It says during the 80s, the Hambros and the Westminster Banks became involved with the IOR. Now remember, that's the Vatican Bank. And it says, even if tangentially, when a scandal involving about $1.4 million brought down Italy's major Catholic bank in 1982, as we shall see presently. Similar concerns in which the Vatican's millions were invested and reinvested existed practically all over Europe. We've already glanced at the industrial, commercial, financial concerns with global ramifications. The Vatican, as we've already reiterated, has large investments with the Rothschilds of Britain, France, and America, with the Hambros Bank and the Credit Suisse in London and Zurich. Now, what do we know about the Rothschilds? Remember, let's listen to what it says. The Vatican, as we have already reiterated, has large investments, to say the least, with the Rothschilds of Britain. That's Great Britain, the Rothschilds of Great Britain, the Rothschilds of France, and the Rothschilds of America. And what do we know about the Rothschilds? Repeat after me. The guardians of the Vatican Treasury. The Rothschilds are the guardians of the Vatican Treasury. The Rothschilds invest Vatican money. They're the Vatican's bankers. The Rothschilds were in control in Britain, France, and America, with the Hambros Bank, with Credit Suisse in London and Zurich. In the United States, it has large investments with the Morgan Bank. Remember, J.P. Morgan was a Rothschild agent, Chase Manhattan Bank, and First National Bank of New York, the Bankers Trust Company, and others. The Vatican, as we have already seen, has billions of shares in the most powerful international corporations such as Gulf Oil, Shell, General Motors, Bethlehem Steel, General Electric, International Business Machines, yes, IBM, TWA, etc. At a conservative estimate, these amount to more than $500 million in the United States alone. Remember, this book is getting old, so what these numbers could be today, one can only imagine. Now, it continues. It says, the Roman Catholic Church, therefore, once all her assets have been put together, is the most formidable stockbroker in the world. The Wall Street Journal said that the Vatican's financial deals in the United States alone were so big that very often it sold and bought gold in lots of $1 million or more at one time. The Vatican's, listen carefully, the Vatican's treasure of solid gold has been estimated by the United Nations World Magazine to amount to several $billion. A large bulk of this is stored in gold ingots with the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. Now, we know that that is a Jesuit bank, and they make money out of paper and ink, hand it to our federal government, charge it at usury for the United States government to pay its debts, and then takes gold in collateral, gold as security. That's where the gold comes from. And that's why it's stored at the Federal Reserve Bank, a Vatican bank. Our national debt is owed to the Vatican. The Vatican is holding United States gold as security. Let's read this again. Make sure this sinks in. The Vatican's treasure of solid gold has been estimated by the United Nations World Magazine, pretty authoritative magazine, wouldn't you think, to the amount of several $billion. A large bulk of this is stored in gold ingots with the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, while the banks in England, which Rome also controls, the Rothschilds also control, and Switzerland hold the rest. Jesuit banks hold all the gold for the Vatican. And it says, but this is just a small portion of the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church, which in the United States alone, as we've already seen, is greater than that of the 5 wealthiest giant corporations of the country. When to that is added all the real estate, property, stocks, and shares abroad, then the staggering accumulation of the wealth of the Vatican becomes so formidable as to defy any rational assessment, says this author. The enormous financial reserves of the Vatican in the 70s and 80s can be gauged by the fact that its financial reserves equaled the official holdings of France, both in gold and foreign securities. The Vatican can be a match not only for France, but equally for Britain herself. The United Kingdom's dollar reserves, in fact, were estimated at $1,000 million. That's $1 billion, a sum equivalent to only 1/5 of the Vatican's marketable stock, which, according to level-headed and reputable financiers, totaled the world over more than 2,000 million, that's 2 billion pounds sterling, or between $5,000 and $6,000 million. Reliable sources at this period indicate that the Vatican at the same time had a gold reserve of $11 billion, 3 times the gold reserve of Great Britain. This is a very conservative estimate. Furthermore, it must be remembered that it covers only the Vatican's holding in stock exchanges and other negotiable values. In short, this astronomical sum is limited to the Vatican's liquid capital reserves. We're talking about liquid money, liquid wealth. Now, taken in this way, therefore, the Vatican, at a most conservative estimate, is the world's largest stockholder or shareholder, with a portfolio of quoted securities totaling the equivalent of $5,600 million, that's $5.6 billion, and $6 billion by 1970 and 71. The volume of the Vatican's worldwide stocks and shares in the 80s was put at $5 billion to $10 billion. Thanks to this, therefore, the Vatican was and still is the most redoubtable wealth accumulator and property owner in existence. No one knows for certain how much the Roman Catholic Church was or is worth in terms of dollars and other currencies, not even the Pope himself. This is the true situation borne out by a Vatican official who, when asked to make a guess at the Vatican's wealth today, replied very tellingly, quote, "Only God knows," unquote. And you can bet the creator of all the gold knows how much of it Rome owns and how she got it. The author says that's the tersest summing up of the matter. And they tell me the Vatican can't possibly control the kings of the earth. The Vatican can't possibly control the government of the United States. Now, chapter 27 is entitled "The Best Thing to Have Happened Since Jesus Christ." The economic magnitude of the Vatican wealth in the 70s was bound to create problems peculiar to the world of big business, with the result that the Vatican, in common with other financial giants, became increasingly concerned about the future of its investments. You know, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. It says, the more so since the mercurial ups and downs of political instability and the economic fluctuations of world economy were becoming alarmingly frequent. Now, let me tell you something else. Rome is the source of all these ups and downs. She's learned how to manipulate the world, and that through those manipulations, those up and down movements in values of stocks and bonds and securities and currencies and one thing and another, real estate and gold, she's learned how to profit from those ups and downs. And if you orchestrate those ups and downs, you can literally create money out of nothing. And that's what she's good at. The greatest alchemist in the world, the Vatican. In Italy, the portents were even more ominous. The Italian government, pressurized by left-wing groups, in other words, those groups that were against the Vatican, liberals, the Roman Catholic Church would have called them, was demanding that the Vatican be forced to pay its millions of arrears in taxation, promising future tough legislation on tax evasions. Abroad, Europe's prosperity had begun to look unhealthy. The Vatican, sensing the shape of things to come, because she was orchestrating it, right? The Vatican, sensing the shape of things to come, began to seriously rethink its vast financial empire. Its reformulation was soon encapsulated into gradual but steady transference of capital, liquid and otherwise, to safer lands, chiefly to the United States of America. Now, we're talking about a period of time when the Vatican was moving her assets out of Europe, which she was manipulating. Europe was crumbling, was no longer the best place to hold her resources, so she moved them to the United States, where she could gain greater gains on her investments. She was building the United States, which was an economic opportunity. She moved her assets out of Europe and into the United States. What do we see today? We see the Vatican moving her assets out of this country. What is she planning to do? Destroy this country. She's manipulating and moving and transferring her assets out of this country because she knows what's going to happen to the United States. Why? Because she's orchestrating it. Now, when in 1971, therefore, Pope Paul VI told the world that, quote, the church must be poor and should also be seen to be poor, unquote, his words were heard with silent cynicism by the professional money managers busy with Vatican deals. All right? Her people The Vatican's people, her insider traders know how much money she has. And when she pleads poverty, they just roll their eyes and keep dealing for the Pope. Now, he continues, he says, what had prompted Pope Paul VI's comments was that for some time now, the Vatican's expenses had been greater than its income. Also, that Peter's pence had sunk to a mere $3 million a year. Strictly speaking, the Pope had been correct, insofar that he had referred exclusively to the Vatican's administrative budget and not to the Church's vast annual income. See the parsings of words here? The books at the Vatican aren't balancing right now, and we are in poverty, and that's to solicit the sympathies of all the Catholics around the world and all of the Roman Catholic insider tradings in Washington and London and everywhere else. And it says the complaint of the Vatican deficit since then became a kind of ritual smokescreen. It helped the Church to project an image of parsimonious existence, which was wholly unrelated to the factual state of her financial affairs. The operation is always successful with the public, confused by the diverse faces of an organization which acts within a veil of financial convolutions, religious diplomatic equivocations, and departmental euphemisms. Each time the Vatican declares it has suffered a deficit, therefore, the declaration is accepted at its face value, so that it is seen as an impoverished concern, which, having had more expenses than income, is bound to collapse for lack of funds. It is a move which has always yielded world sympathy and a flow of cash to match, sometimes from outside, but very often from inside the Vatican itself, since the money, far from being scarce, is overflowing from the coffers of the very Church it represents. Pope Paul VI was certainly not the first to ask for financial help. His predecessor, the popular Pope John XXIII, set the example following the Second Vatican Council, which he had summoned in the 60s. Remember, this was the ecumenical council to drag the Protestants back into the Roman Catholic Church. You are not churches in the proper sense because you don't have full communion with the Holy See, with the chair of Peter. You're not apostolic churches, so therefore you're not churches in the proper sense. And if you wish to continue as churches, you must come under the Pope's umbrella. All grace comes from the chair of Peter. If you wish to be saved, you must be under Peter's chair. That was the essence of the Second Vatican Council, the Ecumenical Council. Now, that's simply a way to transfer, to add to the Roman Catholic Church the power and the wealth and the influence of those who used to protest against this church of mammon, against this church of Antichrist, against this church of idolatry, and against this church of sodomy. They've now agreed to go back under the terms of the Vatican Council II to become Catholics again, but to maintain their own denominational names. It's spiritual suicide. And it's time for God's people to wake up to it and denounce it for what it is. You partake in her sins, you will partake in her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. And this book is about her iniquities. What God has in store for the Roman Catholic Church will be shared by those ecumenical churches that seek shelter beneath her horrid skirts. Now it continues, the council produced a bill, that is the Vatican Council II, produced a bill of about $4 million. Pope John at first declined paying it on the grounds that the Vatican had not the money. Then, hard-pressed by the harder facts of life, he sold $4 million in gold to the United States of America. It's like putting the gold out of one hand and into the other, isn't it? The total cost of the Vatican Council, however, was far heavier, more than $20 million, with an additional $10 million for quote-unquote extras. Wouldn't you like to know what those extras were? This is, again, the Vatican complained loudly that it could not afford to pay. It appealed to the faithful who donated more generously to Peter's pence and quote-unquote special offerings. Then pressed by hard-faced creditors, he found the money from the church herself. 20 years later, Pope Wojtyła, we're talking about Pope John Paul II, Pope Wojtyła played the same, quote, lack of funds, unquote, trick. The same lack of funds trick. In November of 1979, he summoned the entire College of Cardinals to Rome, the first time of its kind in 400 years, to discuss the piteous state of the Vatican's quote-unquote deficit, which amounted to £8 million sterling. After the meeting, Cardinal Carpio, the Vatican's top financier, announced to the incredulous world that, quote, we, the Church, are reduced to charity, unquote. The assembled cardinals were baffled. Quote, we have seen the accounts, said one, but we can't make out whether the church is booming or on the verge of bankruptcy, unquote. The deficit, so-called, had trebled by 1982 and 1983. By 1984, it would have doubled, it was said. Then it was predicted that it would treble by 1984 and 85. Indeed, an official went so far as to declare that the Vatican would become quote-unquote bankrupt within 5 years. Faced with such a gloomy future, Pope John Paul II summoned the Sacred College of Cardinals a second time in November of 1982 to study the situation. The true motive, however, was more serious. It was the financial scandal of the IOR, that is, the Vatican Bank, in which it had become deeply involved in fraud, running into hundreds of millions of dollars, as we shall see presently. At the end, he said simply that the Church had to and should live only on the proceeds of the charity of good Catholics. See the poor public face the Vatican puts forward? And it says the absurdity of the whole thing was at the same time one of his cardinals had raised over, the absurdity of the whole thing was that at the same time one of his cardinals had raised over $85 million for one diocese alone, that of Cologne, to send to Latin America. Also, that a few years before, the Vatican lost between $40 and $80 million in financial operations. And even more absurd, that the Vatican was, as ever, one of the wealthiest entities in the world. The truth of the matter, of course, was that Pope Wojtyła, John Paul II, just like his predecessor, Pope Paul VI, and his predecessors, claimed poverty, knowing very well that they were the legal representatives of immense wealth, invested in liquid assets, bonds, shares, real estates, and holdings of the Roman Catholic Church. No morality when it comes to money. The Roman Catholic Church is the Church of Antichrist. Now, what about this so-called imminent bankruptcy of the Vatican? The book continues, but reverting to the complaint of Pope Paul VI, who declared that the Vatican would soon be bankrupt. At a conservative estimate, in the 70s, the total income of the Church, according to the authoritative assessment of a United States financial correspondent of the Institutional Investor, a United States magazine highly regarded by American professional money managers, was more than substantial. The impossibility of assessing the exact figures was due mainly to the fact that the man who should have known, Cardinal Vagnozzi, headed the Vatican Prefecture for Economic Affairs, for all his cooperation, avoided direct answers to direct questions, just like a politician, right? It says, after 4 laborious interviews, however, the magazine concluded that the income, as far as it was possible to see from what the Cardinal had revealed, was about $140 million. When it was pointed out that the general assessment of the Vatican's total wealth was about $5 billion, the Cardinal protested, calling the figure absolutely wild. When pressed, however, he admitted that, yes, $500 million was closer to the truth. So which is it, Cardinal? Cardinals have a little trouble with the truth every now and then. Now, it says so much for Pope Paul VI complaining that the Vatican that year had suffered losses of about $11 million, when in fact in stocks, holdings, shares, and financial ramifications and multiplications of dividends in Italy and abroad were flourishing more than ever. Witness also the fact that at that very period it had just sold off, as already seen in the previous chapter, 2/3 of its 15% interest in the Immobilier, the company that built Washington's famed Watergate Hotel. This in addition to having stocks in General Motors, General Electric, Shell, Bethlehem Steel, Gulf Oil, IBM, and other similar mighty financial concerns. Following his well-published pleas of poverty and the ambiguous information of Cardinal Vagnozzi, Pope Paul VI began to take the first silent steps aimed at reorganizing the Church's financial structure. Now, you might know that this reorganization is to hide her assets, to make her pleas of poverty more convincing, right? It says the main objective of the operation, the sound reinvestment of the Vatican's funds, and above all, its massive transfer of its visible and invisible assets abroad. I'm going to ship them across the pond. The easier to make it appear, at least in Europe, that she's poverty-stricken, right? To that effect, he chose 3 financial experts. Cardinal Vagnozzi, a former apostolic delegate to Washington, and an open admirer of the American way of doing business, especially in financial matters, and who could never give enough praise to the American Roman Catholic hierarchy for the way they managed to run and increase the wealth of their dioceses. Vagnozzi's heroes being Cardinal Spellman, Cushing, and McIntyre, whom we've already encountered. You know, Moneybag Spellman, who was outdone by his two counterparts, Cardinal Cushing and Cardinal McIntyre. Now, Archbishop Caprio became the head of a team of financial and real estate experts specializing in international operations with one Paul Marcinkus from Chicago. The latter to direct the Institute for Religious Affairs, that's the IOR, the Vatican Bank, another name for the Vatican Bank, the author says, the Institute for Religious Works, or the IOR for short, besides being what its name implies, was also an entity which provided a full range of banking services that embraced not only the whole of Europe, but also certain branches of the banking system of the United States, as we shall have occasion to see presently. Pope Paul's plans to transfer the Vatican's funds outside Italy was first given sudden urgency with the international financial crisis provoked by President Nixon's moves to shore up the dollar in August of 1971. So here we have a Vatican manipulation of the Nixon administration. You can bet your horses on it. It says the Vatican, to minimize its losses, you know, she's already been tipped off of what Nixon's going to do. And it says the Vatican, to minimize its losses, was forced to change most of its millions of dollars into German marks and Swiss francs. This it did before Nixon's decision had been announced, thus reducing its potential losses by millions. The warning, given in secret from the United States, saved the Vatican millions. The passing of secret information from the United States to the Vatican prior to official financial U.S. moves was not the first time nor the last, since the Vatican has always had an eager group of American bankers and financial experts, eager indeed, ready to pass such information to Rome. Rome's financial intelligence is second to none. She makes money on every move of the market. And it says these are not only Catholics, these people who are tipping off the Vatican, it says these are not only Catholics, but a band as varied as there can be amongst many, to cite only two, Morgan Guaranty Trust and Hambros Bank. By 1983, the volunteers have multiplied by the dozens. Notwithstanding the secret warning, the Vatican's reserves that year in United States currency had been reputedly cut to a mere million. The experience caused the Vatican to take action in earnest and go ahead with the original vague plans to move its funds to safer grounds. The mounting pressure in Italy for the Vatican to pay its taxes, including its arrears, did the rest. This, notwithstanding the fact that the Vatican, after pleading poverty, promised that it might pay, quote-unquote, in installments because it was, quote-unquote, too poor. When 1970 came and then 1980, the Vatican had not paid one single penny. By 1983, after having paid a nominal small sum, it claimed again preferential treatment, thus justifying its nickname, the biggest tax evader of the country. Paul VI's rethinking was not an original idea. The Vatican had done its rethinking in financial terms long before. In fact, it began when Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty in 1929, and Italy gave the Vatican about $100 million as compensation for the Vatican's territorial losses, as already indicated. We're talking about the Papal States, remember? Now, Pius XI, then reigning Pope, asked a banker, B. Nogara, an Italian Jew, always a Jew, for his advice as to what to do about the money. Nogara suggested that the money should be invested, however, without any theological consideration or restrictive moral scruples, since money has its own laws that are outside religion. So there's the Vatican's moral strategy with regard to money. And it said he wisely said that 1/3 of the $100 million be turned into solid gold and placed in the United States in Fort Knox, where they have been to this day, says the author, and the rest turned into shares in real estate. So who owns the gold in the Federal Reserve Bank and Fort Knox? Good portion of it is owned by the Vatican. And it says by the time that Nogara died in 1958, the Vatican, thanks to Nogara's policy, had become involved with a vast network of thousands of holdings, companies, real estate, chemicals, construction, electronics, plastics, cement, the owner of many large insurance companies, industrial concerns, and the controller of banks throughout Italy. The Nogara Midas touch, in fact, was so successful that thanks to his principle that the Vatican must not be restricted in its financial dealings by theological consideration, his original investment by 1982 and 83 had made the Vatican one of the heaviest investors, to the tune of more than $1.2 billion on the New York stock market, to quote only one typical example. So much so that the Vatican financial might by 1983 was realistically estimated to more than $12 billion. No wonder that Pope Pius XI's papal successors are credited with having called the appearance of Nogara at the Vatican the, quote, best thing to have happened to the Roman Catholic Church since our Lord Jesus Christ, unquote. Pope Paul VI, while not an expert on financial affairs, nevertheless was anxious to see that the Vatican money problems be handled with expertise by the right people. With that in view, he scanned the horizon to discover someone who, like the fabulous Nogara, could not only safeguard the Vatican's wealth, but equally, if possible, increase it. When exiled in Milan, northern Italy, by Pope Pius XI because of his left-wing leadings, Archbishop Montini, as he was then known, that's the future Pope Paul VI, met a little-known Sicilian, quote-unquote, financial expert who appeared to make money from practically nothing. The man proved his worth by helping Monsignor Montini, the future Pope Pius VI, to solve an urgent local financial problem with uncanny efficiency and promptitude. In addition, the man seemed to have specialized in the recondite operational crisscrossing of national and international financial concerns with its concurrent transfer of capital from Italy to other countries, the very qualification which the Vatican needed most at that critical period. When Monsignor Montini eventually became Pope Paul VI, and the harassing problems of the transference of the Vatican assets outside Italy, plus the pressing demands of the Italian government for the payment of tax arrears, confronted his pontificate, he remembered the Sicilian financier, the Howard Hughes of Italy, as he was later to call him. The Sicilian expert, one Sindona by name, welcomed the papal invitation. Thereupon, the Pope's blessing and the millions of the Roman Catholic Church at his disposal, he plunged headlong into coordinating, transferring, and multiplying the Vatican financial fortunes. The Vatican had found a worthy successor to the miracle man Nogara at last. We're talking about Michele Sindona. And now we're off to the races. This is chapter 28 of the book. It's entitled The Pope's Very Own Financial Little Fox. In the 70s, as the Vatican's financial problems multiplied, a man like Sindona seemed to have been sent by divine providence. Sindona accepted the task with unbounded enthusiasm. He always felt at home whenever dealing with high finances and complicated national and international deals. When Pope Paul VI, therefore, asked him to help solve the Vatican's current financial impasse, Sindona had no doubts about his ability to do so. The Pope thought likewise. He had already had positive proof of Sindona's magic touch back in 1962 when, as Archbishop of Milan, he had found himself in trouble in connection with the building of an old folks' home. Sindona had volunteered to help with finding the money. He would use his banking connections, he promised, and presto, he presented the delighted Monsignor Montini with $2.5 million. It was a miracle, or more accurately, the work of a financial wizard. Archbishop Montini was impressed, and the two men became friends. The Archbishop's confidence was justified, for although Sindona at this time was hardly known in high ecclesiastical circles in Rome, Monsignor Montini had rightly reckoned that Sindona's skill could and would free the Vatican of its increasing monetary worries. The man's achievements, after all, were there for all to assess. Within less than 2 decades, Michele Sindona had formed and controlled no less than 22 international companies, all interlocking within such a complicated financial maze that nobody appeared to comprehend it with the exception of its manipulator, Sindona himself. The prestigious magazine Fortune was so impressed that it focused its keen financial eyes upon Sindona's operations. It came to the conclusion that Sindona was worth a startling $450 million, the richest man in Italy and one of the richest in Europe. The achievement, more than exceptional, was almost unique, since the man had started from nothing. Sindona's father had been a chicory seller back in Sicily, his father a poor farm worker. Sindona had his first studies, here's the clue, Sindona got his first studies with the Jesuits, then at Messina's University, where he became one of its youngest lawyers. He began at once to act for immigrants with interests in America. While busy with them, he sought the friendship of the most energetic Archbishop of Sicily because he had a record of number of church buildings to his credit. At the same time, he tried his hand at international taxation. In a very short time, he became the legal tax expert in Italian-American issues and a favorite consultant with Italian-American investors. Then he met a man, a small banker who controlled a minor financial concern called the Banca Privata Finanziaria. The man owned also a steel foundry. The banker told Sindona that he wanted to get rid of the foundry. Sindona obliged, bought the foundry himself, and then he promptly sold it at a good profit to the United States American Crucible Company. Shortly afterwards, cash in hand, Sindona also got hold of the bank itself. He used the latter, the bank, as the first stepping stone to realize his dream, the takeover of international concerns via international operations. One of his earliest achievements was that of getting hold of 10% of the shares of Libby's food company in Italy, which he promptly sold to Nestle's. The move netted him several $1 million. Success breeds success, and now Sindona, more confident than ever, ventured outside Italy to a notorious tax-exempt haven, Liechtenstein. There he set up a holding company under the former vice president of the American Crucible Company. The transference proved so beneficial that Sindona dared to approach well-known private banks, Continental Illinois National Bank and Trust Company of Chicago, and Hambros of London, with whom he linked his own Banca Privata Finanziaria. It so happened, and that was certainly no surprise to him, that the former bank had very strong ties with the Vatican's most important financial department, namely the Institute for Religious Affairs, of the IOR, a channel to anyone wanting to transfer money anonymously in and out of Italy. So we've got the bank of the Vatican Bank, the Institute for Religious Works, the IOR, being a money laundering operation. Now, Sindona was the ideal man since he had a habit of keeping tight-lipped about everything he did, especially about his main client's discreet financial operations, the Vatican. Astute observers, however, soon noticed how he always benefited as much as his august client whenever making a deal. Yet because of the nature of most of his clandestine operations, it was impossible to substantiate the charge. Sindona's activities could and did stultify friends and foes alike, not excluding the Vatican, where it was rumored that even the Pope was never sure when his chief financial advisor was operating for the Church, for himself, or for both simultaneously. When, therefore, such rumors reached Cardinal Vagnozzi, chief of the prefecture of the Vatican's economic affairs, and Bishop Marcinkus, the head of the IOR, they didn't mind. Sindona's operations were advantageous to the Church, they declared, and that's really what mattered. The Cardinal's toleration appeared to have been justified. since Sindona by now had become almost indispensable whenever the Church found herself in some embarrassing or difficult situation. Thus, whereas it was true that Sindona used the Church whenever dealing with some dubious financial operations of his own, it was equally true that the Vatican used him as a front man each time it was confronted with painful dilemmas. Such as when, for instance, it was disclosed, as mentioned previously, that the Vatican owned and controlled a chemical concern that manufactured contraceptives. We mentioned this the other day. Yes, the Vatican was, essentially the creator of the birth control pill. Now, again, it says, such as when, for instance, it was disclosed, as mentioned previously, that the Vatican owned and controlled a chemical concern that manufactured contraceptives and even explosives, the Instituto Farmacologico Sirona of Rome. That's the IFS. Now, furthermore, that the Instituto's chairman was none other than Prince G. Pacelli, a nephew of Pope Pius XII. And this at the time when the Pope was condemning almost daily birth control. The Church of Hypocrisy. Let me tell you something. If I haven't said it already, the Vatican's secret policy is to make sure that government-sponsored abortion is available to heretics. Okay? That's why we have the pill. That's why we have all these means of birth control. Rome doesn't have to worry about her Catholics. She teaches them that they, on pain of excommunication, they must not practice birth control. It's all about demographics. That's why you'll never see a Roman Catholic politician pass, although their public rhetoric is always anti-abortion and anti-contraception, they always pass the bills. It's because Rome regards this country a heretic nation. And birth control and abortion, government-sponsored, is always going to be available in this country until it's made a Roman Catholic country. But for now, Rome's satisfied that her Catholics don't commit these sins, and so that they'll eventually outgrow and outpopulate the heretical sects of this country and take it over. It's all about demographics. Rome has no moral stand whatsoever on abortion issues and birth control.